He shrugged off the only jacket he owned, the biting wind hitting him instantly. He held it out to the freezing, elegantly dressed woman, shivering uncontrollably beside him at the desolate bus stop. You don't have to do that," she stammered, staring first at the worn coat, then at his tired eyes. "I've already lost enough today," he replied, his voice rough. "This coat. It's the only thing I have left worth giving. Sometimes the coldest nights forge the most unexpected connections, binding disparate souls together before they even know each other's stories." The wind wasn't just cold, it was a physical assault. It screamed down the avenues of New York City, carrying shards of ice and snow that swirled relentlessly from a bruised, indifferent sky. Sidewalks vanished under a thickening white blanket, muffling the city's usual cacophony into an eerie hush. Beneath the sputtering, intermittent glow of a lone street lamp at a bus stop that felt like the edge of the world, Arthur Vance stood, hunched a solitary figure, against the urban blizzard. His olive jacket frayed at the cuffs, and thin at the elbows offered little defense. He clutched a worn manila folder to his chest, as if it held the last embers of warmth in his life. Inside lay 5 copies of his resume, each a stark reminder of doors closed, opportunities vanished, 5 silent paper rejections. He exhaled a plume of white vapor, instantly dissolving into the biting air. 46 years old, once Arthur Vance, structural engineer, now widower father, and for the moment homeless. The word landed with a thud, as heavy and cold as the snow rapidly accumulating around his worn-out boots. The neon sign of a nearby pharmacy painted the snowdrifts in a pulsing red glow. 8:41 p.m. The bus was late, swallowed perhaps by the storm. The damp cold had long since breached the cracked leather of his boots, seeping into his bones with numbing persistence. He shifted his weight, the folder crinkling under his tightening grip. Just endure. Just get through the night. Then, emerging like an apparition, through the swirling snow, a woman appeared. She seemed out of place, unreal in the harshness of the night. Perhaps in her late 30s, dressed in a smart business skirt and blouse, utterly devoid of a coat. Her heels clicked sharply on the icy pavement, a jarring sound in the muffled quiet. Wet strands of dark hair clung to her face, and her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, a futile gesture against the elements. She stopped abruptly, under the same meager awning as Arthur, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Her hands visibly shaking, Arthur tried to look away to grant her the anonymity the city usually afforded, but her presence was too striking. There was an air of polished professionalism about her, yet she was clearly desperately freezing. She rubbed her bare hands together vigorously, a useless friction against the penetrating cold. He averted his gaze again. Just another stranger, another soul battling the New York winter, another bus to nowhere fast. But then a vicious gust howled around the corner of the building. The woman flinched, curling further into herself, a shiver racking her frame so intensely it seemed audible over the wind. Arthur glanced back. His jacket wasn't much, threadbare, stained faintly with coffee from a week ago, smelling vaguely of the laundromat soap he used sparingly. But it was something. It was his. He could keep it. Stay silent. Hunch deeper into himself. Be like everyone else who hurried past, heads down, collars up. He didn't. Without conscious thought, the decision made itself. He shrugged off the jacket. The cold hit his own thin sweater like a physical blow, stealing his breath for a second. As he moved, pulling his arm free, he instinctively adjusted the rolled-up sleeve of his sweater beneath a quick, unconscious gesture, revealing just for a heartbeat a jagged, faded white scar that traced a broken line across his forearm. He covered it just as quickly, the motion fluid almost unnoticed before stepping towards her. He held the jacket out. She startled her eyes wide with surprise, maybe a hint of fear. You don't have to do that." Arthur managed a weary smile, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I've already lost enough today," he said, his voice rough but steady. "This coat, it's about the only thing I have left worth giving." She hesitated, her gaze flicking from his face to the offered jacket, then back again, uncertainty warring with the obvious need. "But you need it more than I do." "Not tonight," he insisted softly and gently. Before she could protest further, he draped it over her trembling shoulders. The sudden warmth, the sheer unexpectedness of the gesture seemed to stun her more than the cold had. It smelled faintly of soap, maybe old coffee, something mundane and oddly comforting. She pulled it tighter around herself, an involuntary burrowing motion. Her eyes met his, a complex mixture of gratitude and something else, something guarded, questioning, as if this simple act of kindness from a stranger who looked like he possessed nothing had somehow unsettled her more than the freezing wind. "Thank you," she whispered the words barely audible. He just nodded, folding his own arms tightly across his chest, the cold already biting fiercely through his sweater. They stood in a pocket of shared silence, the snow falling thick and fast around them, a temporary fragile truce against the storm. After a moment that stretched longer than it should have, she turned to him again, pulling the collar of his oversized jacket closer to her chin. "What's your name?" "Arthur, Arthur." "Vance?" "I'm Eleanor," she replied, her voice a little stronger now. "Eleanor Vance. Nice to meet you, Eleanor." A genuine, if tired, sentiment. She glanced at him, then down at the jacket, engulfing her. "You really shouldn't have given me this." He offered another faint smile. "Probably not. But watching someone freeze wasn't an option." Just then, the low rumble of an engine broke the spell. Headlights cut through the white curtain as the bus finally lumbered to the curb, its brakes hissing. Eleanor moved towards it, then paused at the steps, turning back. Do you have somewhere to go, Arthur?" He shrugged the gesture, non-committal. "Somewhere," he said vaguely, not about to explain the cold embrace of a rusted Chevy truck cab behind a warehouse. She seemed to understand the evasion. Reaching into her sleek purse, she pulled out a crisp, expensive-looking business card and handed it to him. In case you ever need anything." He took it automatically, his cold fingers fumbling slightly. He slipped it into the manila folder without a glance. People said things like that. Empty politeness offered in passing moments. He didn't expect to use it. Didn't expect it meant anything at all. Eleanor stepped onto the bus. She glanced back one last time, his worn jacket wrapped around her like unlikely armor, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Then the doors hissed shut and the bus pulled away, its red tail lights quickly swallowed by the blinding snow. Arthur stood alone again on the deserted street corner. He shivered, a deep tremor running through him. But it wasn't just from the cold anymore. It was something else. Something small, quiet, inexplicably powerful, stirred within the emptiness left by the departed bus and the warmth of his given coat. He looked up at the unforgiving sky, then down at the empty, snow-swept street. Maybe tomorrow, he whispered to the howling wind, the words snatched away as soon as they left his lips. Then, pulling his own arms tighter, he turned and walked away from the flickering light, disappearing into the deepening white night. In the deep silence of a frozen night, the past doesn't just whisper. Sometimes it arrives with the unwelcome chime of a text message. Arthur walked without urgency, his worn boots crunching a lonely rhythm on the snow-covered back streets. There was nowhere to hurry to, no lights left on in a window, no waiting warmth, just the cold metallic familiarity of the '98 Chevy truck parked in the shadows behind an old forgotten warehouse on the industrial edge of the city. He reached it just after 9. The rusted blue paintwork almost invisible against the deepening drifts. The heater had died years ago. The cab was an icebox. He climbed in the worn springs, groaning under his weight, and pulled the door shut. The sound echoing slightly in the profound quiet. Inside the front seat was a jumbled nest of thin blankets and a flattened pillow shoved against the passenger door. A dented lunchbox was tucked beneath the dashboard. He sat for a long moment, the residual chill from his walk without the jacket settling deep in his bones. From the glove compartment, he carefully retrieved a small, battered tin box. Opening it felt like a ritual. Inside lay a single faded photograph, his wife Eliza, smiling, her eyes bright with a light that Arthur sometimes struggled to remember clearly. Beside her their son Leo, maybe 7 years old in the picture, grinning a wonderfully crooked grin, missing a front tooth. Arthur traced the edge of the photo with a cold finger. "Good night, Eliza," he whispered, his voice thick. "Good night, Leo." He leaned his head back against the cracked vinyl seat, closing his eyes, letting the relentless tide of memory wash over him. He had been Arthur Vance, structural engineer. He'd built things that mattered: schools, hospitals, sturdy homes filled with families. He'd had Eliza, who taught kindergarten and laughed easily, even when money was tight. Their son Leo had her laugh, pure, unfiltered joy. They hadn't been rich, not by Manhattan standards, but they'd been fiercely, deeply content, solid. Then the illness had come for Eliza, swift and merciless. Stage 4 by the time they found it. 9 months from diagnosis to gone. Arthur had walked away from his job during those last months, needing every second to be with her, to hold her hand, to manage the pain and the fear. But even before that final necessary departure, things at the firm had grown complicated. A dispute over safety protocols on a major project. His refusal to sign off on corners being cut, the subtle pressure from partners, including Mark Jennings, who saw his caution as obstruction. He'd felt increasingly isolated, pushed towards the edge even before Eliza's worsening condition gave him the undeniable reason to leave. The memory brought a familiar, dull ache, a sense of unfinished business, of a battle lost on multiple fronts. He instinctively rubbed his forearm, where the faint, jagged line of the scar seemed to pulse with a phantom chill beneath his sweater. After Eliza passed, everything else simply disintegrated. Bills became mountains. Savings evaporated like mist. He sold the house, then the furniture. He and Leo moved into smaller and smaller apartments until only the truck remained. Still, he'd tried desperately to shield his son. He'd turned the back seat into a makeshift spaceship, transformed canned soup into campfire feasts, pretended a desolate parking lot was their private backyard. Every morning he'd walked Leo to school, clean-shaven shirt tucked in, projecting a normalcy he hadn't felt in years. "Because my son needs to believe things can get better." He'd told a concerned shelter worker once, and I need to look like I believe that too. He'd scraped by with odd jobs, moving furniture, fixing leaky gutters, sweeping debris at construction sites, anything to keep them together. Until last fall. The social worker had been kind but firm. It wasn't safe. Leo needed stability, warmth a real roof. Arthur hadn't fought it. He knew she was right. Through a blur of tears, he'd signed the papers, hugged Leo tighter than he thought possible, and made a promise, choked with unshed grief. "Just for now, champ, I'll come back for you, I promise." Since then, every day had been a relentless climb. Resume sent into the void. Job fairs that yielded nothing. Freezing nights spent studying building codes at the public library, trying to rebuild a future from fragments. Tonight felt like a step backward, giving away his only coat to a stranger. Eleanor. Why had he done it? Maybe she reminded him fleetingly of Eliza's vulnerability near the end. Or maybe he thought grimly. He just needed one small moment to feel like the man he used to be. The one who provided, who protected, who gave. The sudden vibration of his cheap phone against his leg shattered the silence. He pulled it out the screen, casting a pale blue light in the darkness. A text message. From Mark Jennings. Arthur's breath hitched. He hadn't heard from Mark in years. Hesitantly he opened it. "Heard you're really hitting rock bottom. Vance. Guess some guys just can't catch a break, or maybe never deserved one." Arthur stared at the glowing words, a cold fist clenching in his gut. The casual cruelty, the underlying bitterness that had always simmered beneath Mark's professional veneer. It hit him harder than the freezing air outside, the memory of their final arguments at the firm, Mark's smug satisfaction when Arthur was sidelined. It all came rushing back, mingling with the fresh shame of his current situation. He squeezed his eyes shut, the phone heavy in his hand. Outside, the snow continued its silent, relentless descent. Arthur shoved the phone deep into his pocket, as if burying the toxic words. He pulled the thin, inadequate blankets tighter around his shoulders, leaning his head against the icy window. He didn't have much. Just the ghosts in the truck, the weight of broken promises, the sting of old resentments, and the faint, lingering memory of a stranger's surprised eyes at the bus stop. For now it would have to be enough. In the sterile quiet of immense wealth, sometimes the smallest, most crumpled piece of the outside world holds the most shattering power. Eleanor Vance stepped from the biting wind into the hushed, climate-controlled lobby of her apartment building. The sudden warmth felt almost suffocating, a stark contrast to the raw cold she'd just escaped, still bundled incongruously in Arthur Vance's threadbare olive jacket. The uniformed doorman offered a polite, practiced nod. "Good evening, Miss Vance." But she barely registered him, her mind miles away, replaying the encounter at the bus stop. Her heels clicked softly too loudly on the gleaming marble floor as she crossed to the private elevator, the worn fabric of the coat clutched tightly around her. It felt huge, clumsy, utterly out of place against her tailored skirt and silk blouse, yet undeniably fundamentally warmer than anything she owned. The elevator ascended smoothly, silently depositing her directly into the foyer of her penthouse apartment on the 28th floor. Silence greeted her here too, but of a different kind. Not the muffled hush of snow, but the sterile quiet of modern luxury. No television hummed, no music played, no laughter echoed off the minimalist walls, just the faint electronic sighs of high-end appliances and the distant muted howl of the winter storm against triple-paned glass. It was a space designed for showcasing success, not for living. She dropped her expensive leather purse onto the polished console table, the sound jarring. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she began to peel off the jacket. It smelled faintly of cold air, old fabric and something else. Maybe that laundromat soap Arthur probably used. She was about to fold it, haphazardly, unsure what to do with it, when her fingers brushed against something stiff and unfamiliar, Deep within the inner pocket, curiosity piqued. She reached inside, her fingers closed around a small folded piece of paper. It felt worn, softened by time, and handling creased at the corners, perhaps smudged with the grime of countless days. Carefully she unfolded it, beneath the cool gallery lighting of her entryway. It was a child's drawing. Rendered in bright or slightly smeared crayon, 2 stick figures stood hand in hand beneath a lopsided yellow sun. One figure taller wore a crooked smile. The other, smaller, seemed to radiate simple joy. Beneath the taller figure, uneven block letters spelled out Dad. Beneath the smaller Emmy. A shaky red heart floated between them, and at the very bottom, in the same earnest, uneven script, I love you, Daddy. Leo Eleanor froze. The air left her lungs in a silent rush. She stared at the drawing, the simple words blurring as unexpected heat pricked the backs of 10 Hanvat. Coup Claire Langston her eyes. A tremor ran through her, starting in her hands and spreading upwards. She sank onto the edge of an angular designer couch nearby, the jacket still clutched in one hand, the fragile drawing held reverently in the other. Her throat tightened painfully low. The name slammed into her consciousness like a physical blow. Leo Arthur Vance. The man with the tired eyes and the quiet dignity, holding that worn manila folder at the bus stop. The way he'd said, "I've already lost enough today." It all coalesced with brutal clarity. This wasn't just a kind stranger who'd given her his coat. This was a father separated from his child, carrying this precious, heartbreaking proof of love close to his heart. A father who possessed virtually nothing yet, had unhesitatingly given away his only protection against the freezing night. Her gaze swept around her own apartment. The vast space, the high ceilings, the gleaming surfaces, the curated art that spoke of wealth but not of warmth. Not a single framed photograph, not a single personal memento that wasn't chosen for its aesthetic value. A monument to ambition meticulously crafted, utterly devoid of the simple, messy love radiating from the crayon drawing in her hand. She carefully folded the drawing back along its worn creases and placed it gently on the pristine couch beside her. Then, acting on an impulse she didn't understand, she pulled Arthur's jacket close, hugging it tightly to her chest. It still held the faint scent of him, of laundromat soap perhaps, or maybe just hardship and decency. And suddenly, without warning, the dam broke. Tears, hot and unfamiliar, welled up and spilled over, tracing silent paths down her cheeks. She hadn't cried like this in years. Not really, not. Since she was a lost, frightened 12-year-old girl, huddled on the cold stone steps of a church after running away from another uncaring foster home. That night, another stranger had found her. An old man named Joseph. His face weathered, his eyes kind. He hadn't asked questions. He'd simply taken off his own worn coat, wrapped it around her shivering shoulders, and sat with her in silence until dawn, telling her softly that she mattered, that she'd be okay. It was the first, purest act of selfless kindness she could remember, the first time she had truly felt seen. She never saw Joseph again, but that single moment had ignited a fire in her, a fierce determination to escape, to build a life where she would never be cold or invisible again. And she had, oh how she had, clawing her way through college on scholarships and sheer grit-building infinity group from a single audacious app idea into a tech behemoth. She'd earned every dollar, every accolade, every headline. But somewhere on that relentless climb, she'd forgotten Joseph's quiet lesson. She'd started judging people by their resumes, their connections, their outward signs of success. She'd once dismissed a struggling applicant based on a poorly printed CV and worn shoes, a decision that still occasionally pricked her conscience. Had she denied someone their chance, just as Joseph had given her hers? Arthur's raw, uncalculated kindness, so achingly similar to Joseph's, held up a mirror to that buried regret. Tonight, a stranger hadn't just warmed her body. He'd exposed a chilling coldness within her own success. Eleanor sniffed, wiping her wet cheek with the back of her hand. These tears weren't just for Arthur or the ghost of Joseph. They were for the part of herself she had carefully walled off. She looked again at the drawing at the shaky little heart connecting a father and son. Then at the too large, too worn coat still clutched in her arms, heavy now with a meaning far beyond its material. Worth finding Arthur Vance wasn't just about returning a coat anymore. It wasn't even just about helping a man clearly in need. It was about reconnecting with something vital she had lost. It was about proving to herself that the girl Joseph had saved hadn't entirely disappeared inside the CEO. A quiet, steely resolve began to replace the tears. She had to find him, for Leo, for Arthur, and perhaps most unexpectedly for herself. Worlds apart, one driven by corporate power, the other hidden in plain sight. Yet a single act of kindness creates a thread demanding to be pulled. The next morning, the relentless energy of Infinity Group headquarters pulsed around Eleanor Vance, but she remained anchored to the quiet intensity that had settled over her during the night. On the polished expanse of her desk, beside the perpetually cooling cup of coffee, lay the child's crayon drawing, now smoothed and weighted down by a crystal paperweight. It felt like both an accusation and an invitation. Her resolve hadn't wavered. It had solidified into purpose. She pressed the discreet silver bell on her desk. Moments later, her executive assistant Sophia entered, tablet in hand, poised and efficient. "Yes, Ms. Vance." Eleanor looked up, her gaze direct. "Sophia, I need you to find someone. Urgently." Sophia's expression remained neutral, accustomed to unusual requests, though perhaps not usually this early or with this particular undertone. "Of course, who are we looking for? His name is Arthur Vance." Eleanor paused, gathering the scant details. "I met him last night, around 8:30, 8:40, at the bus stop on 56th and Madison. He gave me his jacket." She gestured vaguely towards the worn garment, now folded on a spare chair. "That's all I have other than his name." Sophia blinked, a flicker of surprise, finally breaking her professional composure. A man at a bus stop. This wasn't their usual target demographic of elusive software engineers or rival executives. Miss Vance with just a name and a location. "He needs help," Sophia Eleanor cut in, her voice low but firm, "and I intend to provide it. Use whatever resources you need. Find him." She added, her eyes meeting Sophia's. "And this stays strictly confidential. No one else needs to know." Sophia nodded, already making mental calculations. "Understood, Miss Vance. I'll get my team on it immediately. The formidable resources of Infinity Group's internal security and research team, typically deployed for corporate espionage or vetting high-level hires, were now redirected to this deeply personal, intensely private mission. Initial searches proved frustrating. Traffic camera footage from the intersection was grainy, obscured by the driving snow. Arthur Vance's figure was a fleeting, blurred shape. Bus manifests for the routes stopping near that time yielded dozens of names, none immediately flagging as the right Arthur Vance. The name itself was common enough to return thousands of hits in standard databases, none matching the profile of a man likely living on the streets. Sophia reported the initial difficulties. "It's proving harder than anticipated, Ms. Vance. The lack of a last known address No recent credit activity, no digital footprint. It's like he fell off the grid years ago. Keep looking, Eleanor replied, her voice tight. He's out there. Her own past, the feeling of being invisible, fueled her insistence. She wouldn't let him remain unseen. The breakthrough came 2 days later. An analyst, cross-referencing old professional licensing databases with city shelter outreach records, found a potential match. Henry Miles, a structural engineer whose license had expired years ago, linked to an old address that eventually led them through a series of subsequent temporary addresses to a vague mention in a social services forum about needing temporary work near the warehouse district in the South Bronx. A final check connected the long-expired engineering license photo, older but recognizably the same man, to the name Arthur Vance, used on a recent sign-in sheet at a day labor dispatch. Crucially, they linked the name to a prepaid phone number with recent activity pinging near that same warehouse area. They had him. Sophia entered Eleanor's office with a thin digital folder displayed on her tablet. We found him. Ms. Vance. Arthur Vance. It appears he previously went by Henry Miles, former structural engineer, highly respected according to old industry articles. Then, nothing for the past several years. No permanent address. Our source confirms he's been seen living out of an old pickup truck parked behind a specific warehouse on Bruckner Boulevard. Eleanor felt a surge of relief, quickly followed by a knot of apprehension. She stood abruptly. I'm going there. Sophia looked alarmed. Ms. Vance, are you sure? It's not the best area. We could send someone from security to make contact, discreetly assess the situation. Perhaps arrange for him to meet you here. No. Sophia Eleanor's voice was quiet, but absolute. She picked up her coat, her own expensive cashmere coat this time. This isn't a corporate summons or a background check. It's personal. She needed to do this herself. Face to face, it felt like the only way to honor the connection, however brief, forged in the cold. An hour later, Eleanor sat in the plush leather back seat of her black sedan as it navigated streets far removed from the gleaming towers of Midtown. Shuttered storefronts stared out like empty eyes. Graffiti screamed from brick walls. People moved with a weariness that felt bone-deep heads bowed against a persistent, biting wind that hadn't lessened much since the snow had stopped. The car slowed, pulling up discreetly, a short distance from the designated warehouse, and she saw it immediately, tucked away in the grimy shadow between the warehouse and a crumbling brick wall, partially obscured by dirty snowdrifts, sat an old, rusted blue Chevy pickup truck. It looked derelict, abandoned like it hadn't moved in months. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car, her expensive heels crunching awkwardly on the dirty gravel-strewn patch of ground. The air smelled of damp concrete diesel fumes and decay. She walked slowly, deliberately towards the truck, feeling vulnerability prickle beneath her composed exterior. Through the grimy windshield, she could just make out a figure huddled in the driver's seat. As she drew closer, the truck door creaked open with a sound like tearing metal. Arthur Vance stepped out, blinking against the unexpected daylight, looking rumpled and disoriented. His eyes found her, widening, first in disbelief, then instantly narrowing with suspicion, and a deep, uncomfortable flush rising on his neck. He looked down at his own wrinkled clothes, his snow-dusted boots, then back at her immaculate appearance, his posture stiffening defensively. Eleanor, he said, his voice rough. Not with sleep, but with caution. She managed a small, uncertain smile, suddenly feeling intensely foolish and intrusive. Hi, Arthur. He didn't return the smile. His arms crossed tightly over his chest, a protective barrier. What are you doing here? The question wasn't curious. It was a challenge. I came to find you, she said simply, the prepared speeches evaporating in the face of his raw defensiveness. He frowned, his gaze sharp, skeptical. Why, he demanded, tracked me down to return the jacket? Or did you feel guilty taking it from a homeless guy? There was a definite edge to his tone, now a bitterness that hadn't been there at the bus stop. No, it's not about the jacket, she insisted, trying to keep her voice steady. It's about what you did, about the kindness. I couldn't just... He cut her off, a short, harsh laugh escaping him. Kindness, lady. You have no idea who I am or what I've done. A thank you card would have been fine. You didn't need to come slumming. He gestured vaguely at the bleak surroundings, then fixed his gaze back on her hard and unwavering. So really, what do you want? They stood facing each other in the grimy alley, the gulf between their worlds feeling vast and insurmountable. The fragile connection from the snowy night seemingly shattered against the harsh light of day. True character is often revealed not in the spotlight, but in the quiet grit of unseen labor under the weight of the world's indifference. A few days after their tense encounter behind the warehouse, Eleanor Vance found herself parked across the street from a sprawling construction site on the industrial fringe of Queens. Sophia's discreet network had tracked Arthur's movements to this location, where he'd apparently secured temporary day labor through the windshield of her sedan. Eleanor watched him unseen. He was bent over a pallet of cinder blocks, lifting and stacking them onto a wheelbarrow with a steady economical rhythm born of hard-won experience. The biting wind whipped around him, tugging at his worn flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, despite the chill revealing the corded muscles beneath. His breath plumed white in the frigid air. There was no wasted motion, just the quiet resolve of a man focused entirely on the task at hand. A man used to being overlooked. She watched for nearly 20 minutes, struck by the incongruity, the precise, intelligent movements of a former engineer applied to brute labor. Then a sleek black SUV pulled up near the site entrance. A man in an expensive overcoat and hard hat emerged. Mark Jennings. Eleanor recognized him instantly from the old company photos Sophia had unearthed during the search. Mark strode onto the site with an air of casual authority, scanning the workers before his gaze landed on Arthur, who was taking a brief water break, sitting on a low concrete wall. Mark approached Arthur, stopping a few feet away, looking him up and down with a barely concealed smirk. Eleanor couldn't hear the words from her car, but Mark's posture, the dismissive wave of his hand, Arthur's sudden stillness, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, it all spoke volumes. Mark said something else, gesturing towards the stacks of blocks, then clapped Arthur mockingly on the shoulder before turning and walking back towards his SUV. Arthur remained seated, staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable, but radiating a tightly coiled tension. The brief, unpleasant encounter settled something in Eleanor's mind. Confirmation of the past conflict Arthur carried, and the kind of casual cruelty he likely faced regularly. After Mark's SUV had driven away, Eleanor took a deep breath, grabbed the thermal cup of coffee she'd brought, and got out of her car. She walked towards Arthur, her boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground. He looked up as she approached, his eyes widening in a clear double take, followed immediately by that now familiar guardedness. He stood quickly, automatically brushing dust from his jeans. "Eleanor," he said, surprise overriding the caution for a split second. "Hi again," she offered, a small, genuine smile. "Hi, Arthur. Thought you might like something warm." She handed him the coffee. He took it hesitantly, his gaze searching hers, suspicion still lurking there. "You really didn't have to track me down again." "I know," she said softly, "but I wanted to." They stood in a moment of awkward silence, the sounds of construction work filling the air around them. She broke it. "Would you come with me? Just for a little while. There's something I'd like to show you." He glanced down at his muddy work boots, then back towards the distant figure of the site foreman. "I've still got a few hours left on the clock." "I already spoke to him," Eleanor said smoothly. "Told him you had an interview." Arthur's eyebrows shot up. "I don't have an interview. You do now." She replied, a hint of challenge in her tone. A short, surprised laugh escaped him, more bewildered than amused. He looked from her back towards the foreman, perhaps weighing the absurdity of the situation against the lingering unpleasantness of Mark's visit. "Okay," he finally conceded, taking a large gulp of the hot coffee. "Okay, let's see what this is all about." The drive downtown was mostly silent. Arthur stared out the window at the passing cityscape, occasionally fidgeting, acutely conscious of his appearance. The dusty jeans, the rough, calloused hands, the faint smell of sweat and concrete clinging to him in the luxurious confines of her car. Eleanor pretended not to notice his discomfort. When they arrived at the gleaming, sky-piercing headquarters of Infinity Group, Arthur hesitated on the marble-floored threshold, his eyes wide as he took in the massive glass walls, the polished chrome accents, the quiet, purposeful hum of dozens of employees moving through the lobby in expensive suits. "I don't belong here, Eleanor," he murmured, his voice barely audible. She turned to him, her expression calm. "Just come upstairs," she urged gently. They rode another silent elevator, this one whisking them to the executive floors. She led him into a spacious private conference room, one entire wall, a floor-to-ceiling window, offering a breathtaking panorama of the city skyline. The contrast with the muddy construction site couldn't have been more jarring. She offered him a seat at the long, polished table, then closed the door and sat opposite him. He cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in the plush chair. So he began, his voice tight. "What's this really about? You found me. You brought coffee. Are you finally returning the coat?" Eleanor shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "No, this isn't about the coat. Arthur, I kept that. Consider it payment for services rendered." Her smile faded, replaced by a serious intensity. "It's mine now." He blinked, confused. "Okay." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze holding his. "I didn't track you down again, just to say thank you either. I came because what you did that night, it reminded me of something important, something this company," she gestured vaguely towards the window, "needs to remember. You showed me that real strength, real value, doesn't always come dressed in a suit or backed by a fancy degree. Sometimes it comes from people like you." "People like me?" he asked, a touch of bitterness returning. "You mean broke guys living in trucks? I mean people who understand things that spreadsheets and market reports can't teach," she countered smoothly. "People who act with integrity, even when it costs them everything." She slid a sleek grey folder across the polished table towards him. "Which is why I brought you here." He eyed the folder suspiciously before picking it up. Inside were official-looking documents, a job proposal, a contract outline. He frowned, flipping through the pages, his confusion mounting. "Cultural and Human Values Advisor." What in the hell is this? "It's a new role." Eleanor explained, her voice. "Even one I created specifically. I need someone inside this company, sitting in on high-level meetings, involved in training development, advising on internal policies. Someone whose primary focus isn't profit margins or market share, but people, empathy, compassion. The human element we risk losing sight of, someone to share their experiences, ask the uncomfortable questions, help shape the actual heart of Infinity Group. Arthur stared at her, then let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, shaking his head as he tossed the folder back onto the table. Eleanor, be serious. Look at me. He spread his hands, indicating his worn clothes, his calloused fingers. I sleep in a truck. I stack bricks for $50 a day. I don't have a degree in psychology. I didn't graduate from some Ivy League school. I haven't built anything meaningful in years. The words tumbled out, laced with frustration and disbelief. What possibly makes you think I'm qualified to advise a billion-dollar corporation on anything? You were an engineer, she stated calmly. Was he corrected sharply? A lifetime ago. You built a moment at that bus stop I'll never forget, she said softly, her gaze unwavering. He looked away, overwhelmed. This isn't charity. Arthur, she continued, her voice regaining its firmness. This is an investment. I believe this role is critical, and I believe you are uniquely qualified because of your experiences. Not despite them. You know what it's like to be invisible, to be counted out, to lose almost everything, and yet you still chose kindness. That tells me more about character and leadership potential than any resume ever could. He opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling for words. I can't, he finally said, his voice low, defeated. I'm just not qualified. Eleanor leaned forward again, her eyes locking onto his. You don't need credentials from Harvard to teach people how to care, Arthur, she said, her voice resonating with conviction. You don't need a fancy degree to understand resilience or empathy or the value of seeing the human being behind the job title. You lived it, and that practical wisdom, that lived experience, is more powerful and more valuable to this company right now than anything you could ever put on paper. Arthur stared down at the folder, then back at her, his expression a tumultuous mix of disbelief, fear and something else, something fragile and unfamiliar that flickered deep within his eyes. Hope raw, terrifying, almost forgotten hope. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no again either. Fear can build walls higher than any skyscraper, but sometimes the key to dismantling them lies hidden in the most unexpected places. Arthur Vance sat frozen on the polished granite bench outside the towering glass and steel monument that was Infinity Group headquarters. The sleek grey folder containing the job proposal lay heavy and unopened in his lap, its crisp edges feeling alien under his calloused fingertips. His eyes stared blankly at the relentless flow of city traffic, but he saw none of it. Inside, a storm raged. It wasn't just disbelief anymore. It was raw, paralyzing fear, the kind that had been his constant companion for years, whispering insidious poison in the lonely hours of the night. It's pity. She feels sorry for you. It's a mistake. A cruel joke. You don't belong. You'll mess it up. You always do. The offer felt less like an opportunity, and more like a beautifully disguised trap designed to lure him out of the numb safety of his despair, only to expose him to ridicule and inevitable failure. How could he possibly step into that world? The world of polished surfaces, confident smiles, and unspoken rules he no longer understood. The world that Mark Jennings inhabited. Every past failure. Losing Eliza. Losing his home, having Leo taken the bitter end of his career tangled with guilt and resentment, rose up like spectres, assuring him this impossible offer was just another path to humiliation. He couldn't open the folder. He couldn't face the hope it represented, because hope was a fragile thing, easily crushed. He didn't notice Eleanor approach until she sat beside him, the subtle scent of her expensive perfume cutting through the city air. She followed his gaze to the untouched folder. "You haven't opened it," she observed softly. A dry, humorless chuckle escaped him. "Didn't think I needed to." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes hard with defiance, born of fear. "I already know how this story ends." "Eleanor," how she asked, quietly tilting her head. "Someone like me," he gestured vaguely at himself, "doesn't end up working in a place like that." He nodded towards the imposing building behind them. "You don't build an empire like Infinity by hiring broken-down guys who sleep in trucks." He met her gaze directly. "You think I believe you made that offer for any reason other than pity?" She held his gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, instead of arguing, she stood up. "Come with me, Arthur," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Just for an hour. No suits, no pressure, no meetings." She offered a small, tentative smile. "Just trust me," he hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse to retreat back to the familiar misery of his truck. But there was something in her eyes, not pity, but a kind of steady, quiet conviction that disarmed him. And besides, what more did he have to lose? Wearily against his better judgment, he stood. They drove in silence again, but this time away from the gleaming towers of Manhattan, heading towards a quieter, older part of the city, a neighborhood of modest brick buildings and local shops. After about 30 minutes, Eleanor pulled the car over in front of a cheerful, unassuming red brick building with a slightly faded green awning. A brightly painted sign above the door read, "Joseph's Place, a safe space for every child." Arthur looked at it, puzzled. He followed her inside. The contrast with the cold corporate world they'd just left was immediate and overwhelming. The air smelled faintly of crayons, warm milk, and inexplicably bread baking. Brightly colored walls were covered in children's paintings, handprints, and quotes about kindness. Laughter, high, joyous, unfiltered, echoed from somewhere down the hall. It felt alive. Real. Eleanor led him past a small community kitchen, where volunteers were preparing snacks, through a cozy reading room piled high with second-hand books, and into a wide, sunlit playroom filled with donated toys and handmade posters. Children of various ages were sprawled on colorful rugs, building block towers, drawing pictures engrossed in their play. "This place," Eleanor said quietly, stopping near a wall adorned with dozens of painted handprints. "It's named after the man who saved me." Arthur looked at her, waiting. "I grew up in the foster system." She began, her voice softer. Now stripped of its usual corporate authority, bounced around a lot. Some homes were okay. Others weren't. One night when I was 12, after a particularly bad fight, I ran away. It was freezing, even colder than the other night. I ended up huddled outside a church, just waiting for morning, thinking maybe I'd just disappear. She paused, her gaze distant for a moment. "He found me there, an old man named Joseph. He didn't ask a lot of questions, didn't call the authorities right away. He just sat with me, took off his own thin coat and wrapped it around me, told me I mattered." She turned to face Arthur, her eyes locking with his. "I never saw him again after that morning," she continued. "But that one act, that moment of being seen, it changed everything. It gave me the fight I needed." She took a breath. "Years later, though, when I was clawing my way up, so focused on proving I was tough that I didn't need anyone, I made a mistake. I turned someone away. Someone who came to my small, struggling startup, looking for a chance. They looked a bit lost, like I must have looked. That night Joseph found me, and I judged them too quickly. Arthur. Based on their clothes, their nervousness, I dismissed them. And I've always regretted it. I missed my chance to be their Joseph. She gestured around the vibrant room. Building this place wasn't just about honoring Joseph's memory. It's my constant reminder to look deeper, to not make that mistake again. Her gaze softened as she looked directly at him. And last week, standing at that bus stop, someone else gave me a coat. Didn't know who I was. Didn't ask for anything. Just saw someone freezing and acted. She held his gaze. You remind me so much of him. Arthur. Not just because of the coat, but because of the person you clearly are underneath all the hardship. Arthur stood motionless, the sounds of children's laughter washing over him, Eleanor's unexpected vulnerability disarming him completely. He looked around the room, at the bright drawings, the volunteers patiently helping with puzzles, the sheer unadulterated life buzzing around him. It felt miles away from the cold, cynical world he'd inhabited for so long. He felt the sting of tears behind his eyes, hot and unfamiliar. Eleanor gently touched his arm. I don't need you to fit into some corporate mold. Arthur, she said earnestly, I need your perspective. I need you to help remind us. She seemed to encompass the entire city outside the window with a slight gesture of what really matters, of what it means to truly care. He couldn't speak. He looked down, trying to blink back the tears. But they came anyway, silent tracks carving paths through the grime on his cheeks. It wasn't sadness. It was the shattering release of years of pent-up grief, failure and loneliness. It was the profound shock of being truly seen, valued, needed. He slowly lifted his head and met her gaze. And then he nodded. Not for the job title. Not for the money. Not even for the escape from the truck. He nodded because, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he believed her. He believed he might still matter. He was still human. Starting over isn't just about a new place. It's about rediscovering your voice in a world that had previously rendered you silent. Arthur Vance's first official day at Infinity Group began not with a bang, but with the quiet awkwardness of being the inexplicable new element in a finely tuned machine. There was no welcome announcement, no formal introduction, beyond Eleanor briefly presenting him. This is Arthur Vance, our new cultural and human values advisor, to a handful of key department heads in a sterile, glass-walled meeting room. Their smiles were polite, their handshakes brief, but their eyes held a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed skepticism. Whispers undoubtedly circulated. The CEO's strange project, the man from the streets. He could almost hear Mark Jennings's sneering commentary echoing in the background hum of the ventilation system. He didn't try to impress them with jargon. He didn't know or strategies he didn't understand. His small temporary office felt alien, but he settled in attending meetings mostly as an observer. Initially, he listened. He watched the dynamics, the subtle power, plays, the pressure points. When he finally began to speak, his contributions were simple, almost jarringly human in the context of budget projections and market analytics. How will this accelerated timeline impact the development team's stress levels? He asked quietly during one high-pressure product launch meeting. Have we thought about the message this marketing campaign sends from an ethical standpoint? He inquired in another. His questions were often met with brief silences, confused looks, or polite but dismissive answers from managers focused on the bottom line. He wasn't speaking their language. The first real test came during his second week. A vital cross-departmental software integration project had ground to a halt, bogged down in acrimony and finger-pointing between the lead managers of the marketing and engineering teams, Sarah Chen and Ben Carter. Deadlines were looming, tensions were high, and blame was flying thick and fast. Eleanor, perhaps seeing an opportunity, quietly asked Arthur to sit in on their next mediation meeting. "Just listen, Arthur," she'd said. "See what you observe." He entered the conference room to find Sarah and Ben already engaged in a barely civil argument, flanked by nervous team members. The air crackled with hostility. Arthur took a seat at the edge of the table, saying nothing, simply observing as they rehashed the same tired complaints, each defending their team, neither truly listening. They mostly ignored his presence. After nearly an hour of unproductive stalemate, Arthur cleared his throat softly. All eyes turned to him, mostly with annoyance. "Mr. Vance, with all due respect," Ben Carter started, clearly irritated. "I'm not sure what input you could possibly have on—" "I wasn't going to offer input on the technical issues," Arthur interrupted quietly but firmly. "I was just wondering, Ben, what's your biggest worry if this project fails completely?" Ben blinked, taken aback by the direct personal question. He hesitated, then admitted grudgingly, "My team's reputation takes a hit. We look incompetent." Arthur nodded slowly, then turned to Sarah. "And you, Sarah, what's your primary concern here?" She frowned, suspicious. "That engineering's delays make us miss our market window and look unresponsive to client needs." "Okay," Arthur said, leaning forward slightly. "So Ben's worried about his team looking bad internally, and Sarah's worried about the company looking bad externally." He paused, letting the simplification hang in the air, instead of listing what the other team isn't doing. "What's one thing specifically, Ben, that you feel your team needs from marketing right now to help you succeed?" He then turned and asked Sarah the same question regarding engineering. It wasn't magic, but the shift in focus, from blame to need, from accusation to vulnerability, cracked the hostile facade. The managers, forced to articulate specific needs rather than general complaints, started a tentative, more constructive dialogue. A small path forward emerged. While the core issues weren't solved in that one meeting, the immediate deadlock was broken. People noticed the CEO's pet project had calmly navigated a storm that seasoned executives couldn't. The whispers about Arthur started to change, tinged now with curiosity. Even Respect Eleanor, briefed by Sophia, who had heard about the meeting, offered Arthur a quiet, knowing smile later that day, but said nothing, letting him own the small victory. She ensured he had the resources he requested, a slightly larger office access to internal reports, but largely allowed him the space to define his role organically. Outside of work, the foundations of Arthur's life began to solidify. With Eleanor discreetly guiding him through the baffling rental market and utilizing the modest housing stipend included in his compensation package, Arthur found a small, clean, one-bedroom house for rent in a quiet, working-class neighborhood on the edge of Brooklyn. It wasn't fancy, but it had solid walls, a tiny patch of overgrown garden out back, and, crucially, a second small room. The most significant piece clicked into place a few weeks later. Leo, now 18 and enrolled in his first semester at a nearby community college. Leo moved in. Their first dinner together in the small kitchen was simple spaghetti and garlic bread, eaten at a second-hand table. Awkwardness mingled with overwhelming relief finally. Leo looked across the table, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. "You kept your promise." "Dad," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Arthur couldn't speak. He just reached across the table and squeezed his son's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the long, hard road they had both travelled to reach this simple, extraordinary moment. Later that night, sitting in the quiet living room, listening to the reassuring sound of Leo studying in his room, Arthur felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. Fragile, yet undeniably real a home. His son. A job where he might actually be making a difference. It wasn't the life he'd lost, but it was a life he could start building. Trust isn't built in grand declarations, but in the quiet accumulation of shared moments, unguarded conversations, and the courage to be vulnerable. Months slipped by, marked by the changing seasons outside the towering windows of Infinity Group. Arthur Vance's presence, once an anomaly, became a quiet fixture within the company's ecosystem. His small office, initially sparse, gradually filled with second-hand books, donated plants, and the constant aroma of brewing coffee, evolving into an unlikely sanctuary. He wasn't a manager or a therapist, but he had become something arguably more valuable: a listener. His approach remained unchanged, empathy over directives, questions over answers, yet the impact rippled outwards. Sophia quietly reported to Eleanor a noticeable decrease in formal complaints channeled through HR, and fewer escalations required for interdepartmental squabbles. Managers, initially skeptical, began discreetly seeking Arthur's perspective before implementing potentially unpopular policies. Employees, from interns to senior developers, found their way to his door, sometimes with work stress, sometimes with personal struggles, often just needing a space where they could speak honestly without fear of judgment. He didn't offer easy solutions, but he offered perspective, reminding them of their own resilience, validating their frustrations, making them feel seen. The most profound affirmation of his purpose came late one Friday afternoon. Arthur had just finished facilitating a small workshop on managing workplace anxiety when a young man, barely older than Leo, lingered behind. He looked pale, exhausted, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. "Mr. Vance." The young man began, his voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to say something." Arthur waited patiently. Last month, the young man swallowed hard, looking down at his fidgeting hands. I was done. Ready to quit. Everything life. I couldn't see a way forward. He looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "But then I attended one of your earlier sessions. You said something about how people don't need to be fixed. They just need to be heard. No one had ever said that to me before. It felt like someone finally saw me, not just the mistakes I was making." He took a shaky breath. "If it weren't for you, for those words, I don't think I'd be here today, sir." Arthur stood very still, the air seeming to leave his own lungs. The weight of the young man's confession settled on him, immense and humbling. He stepped forward slowly and placed a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. I'm really glad you are here," Arthur said, his own voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected. After the young man left looking lighter than when he arrived, Arthur sank down into his chair, the sudden quiet of the room amplifying the echo of those words. He had once wondered if he could ever truly matter again. Now, irrevocably, he had his answer. As Arthur found his footing professionally, his connection with Eleanor deepened, evolving organically beyond their initial, unusual circumstances. Lunches together became a regular occurrence, sometimes joined by Sophia. Other times, just the two of them finding a quiet corner in the company cafeteria or a nearby park bench. Walks to the subway station after work became longer, filled with comfortable silences, punctuated by observations about the city, or tentative questions about each other's day. One Saturday, Eleanor surprised him by showing up at his small rented house in Brooklyn, armed with bags of groceries. She'd spent the afternoon helping him wrestle with the overgrown patch of weeds in his tiny backyard, laughing as they both got covered in dirt before joining him, and a shyly pleased Leo for a simple dinner. Seeing her there, relaxed and unguarded, sharing pizza at his second-hand kitchen table and talking easily with Leo about his college courses felt both surreal and perfectly natural. They began sharing fragments of their pasts, carefully navigating the boundaries they had both erected long ago. He spoke hesitantly about Eliza's love for teaching her infectious laugh. She occasionally let slip frustrations about the crushing loneliness of command, the constant pressure to be infallible. They were two guarded souls, slowly, cautiously lowering their shields, finding unexpected comfort in the quiet company of someone who understood instinctively the weight of carrying invisible burdens. One late afternoon, finding themselves working late on a minor crisis involving a server outage, they ended up sharing take-out Thai food in Eleanor's vast, silent office overlooking the glittering tapestry of the city lights. The easy camaraderie felt miles away from their first tense meetings. As they packed up the containers, Eleanor walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing out at the sunset, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. Arthur joined her, standing beside her in comfortable silence. "You've changed this place, Arthur," she said softly, without looking at him. He chuckled quietly. "No," he replied, shaking his head. "I think I just reminded people of things they already knew deep down." She finally turned her head, her eyes meeting his in the reflected glow of the sunset. "And reminded me too," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. In that shared gaze, an unspoken acknowledgement passed between them, a recognition of the profound, unexpected impact they'd had on each other's carefully constructed lives. The upcoming company-wide One Kindness Day event, which Eleanor had enthusiastically started planning with Arthur's input, felt like a natural extension of this quiet transformation, a chance to celebrate the very principle that had brought them together. Sometimes the brightest celebrations cast the longest shadows, forcing hidden truths into the stark, unforgiving light. The soaring atrium of Infinity Group headquarters was transformed. Gone were the usual sleek minimalist banners touting quarterly earnings and product launches. In their place hung swathes of soft white fabric. Strings of warm fairy lights twinkled like captured stars, and a massive, elegantly lettered sign proclaimed the theme: One Kindness Day Employees. Milled about, dressed in their Friday best, a low buzz of anticipation replacing the usual focused intensity. It felt less like a corporate event and more like a communal gathering, a testament to the subtle shift Arthur Vance had helped foster over the past year. Eleanor Vance stepped onto the temporary stage, quieting the room with her presence. She surveyed the crowd, her usual commanding aura softened by a genuine warmth. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice resonating clearly through the speakers. "Today isn't about metrics or milestones or market share. It's about moments, the small, often unseen moments that define our shared humanity." The room listened intently, a little over a year ago. Eleanor continued her gaze, drifting slightly as if seeing the past. "I was standing at a bus stop in the freezing cold. I was tired, alone, and frankly more lost than I even realized." A low murmur rippled through the audience as many recalled the story that had circulated in hushed tones. And then a man, a complete stranger, did something simple but profound. He saw someone in need, and he gave me his coat. She smiled softly. It was old, it was worn, but it was everything in that moment. Because it reminded me that true kindness doesn't wait until it's convenient or calculated. It shows up when the world least expects it, often from the most unexpected places. She turned towards a tall easel beside the podium, draped in velvet cloth. With a practiced movement, she removed the covering. There, preserved behind museum-quality glass, hung Arthur's frayed olive-drab jacket. It looked small and insignificant against the backdrop of corporate power, yet it held the rapt attention of the entire room. Beneath it, engraved on a polished bronze plaque, were the words, "One small act of kindness can rewrite a life." That single act, Eleanor's voice wavered almost imperceptibly. Didn't just change my night, it changed the trajectory of my life and ultimately the culture of this company. And today, we honor not just that moment, but the man whose quiet generosity started it all. She turned towards the edge of the stage, her eyes searching the crowd near the front. "Arthur Vance, will you please come up here?" A wave of warm applause broke out. Arthur rose slowly from his seat near the front row, where he sat beside a proud-looking Leo. He wore a simple dark suit, borrowed, Eleanor knew, from a friend at Joseph's place, but pressed with meticulous care. He made his way towards the stage, his face lined with time and hardship, but carrying a newfound lightness, a quiet sense of peace that hadn't been there a year ago. He stepped onto the stage beside Eleanor, offering her a shy, grateful smile. But before Eleanor could speak again, a harsh voice cut through the appreciative applause. "This is a joke, right?" Heads turned. Pushing his way aggressively through the crowd towards the stage was Mark Jennings, his face flushed. His eyes narrowed with undisguised contempt. He stopped directly in front of the stage, glaring up at Arthur and Eleanor. "This is who you're celebrating." "Eleanor!" Mark sneered, his voice dripping with scorn, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This failure, you put him on a pedestal, give him some made-up job title. Do any of you people know who Arthur Vance or Henry Miles or whatever he calls himself now really is?" A shocked silence fell over the atrium. Eleanor stepped protectively closer to Arthur, whose face had gone pale, the fragile peace shattering in his eyes. Sophia moved quickly to intercept Mark, but he waved her off. He didn't just leave his prestigious engineering career. Mark spat, his voice ringing with malicious triumph. He was fired for gross incompetence. His miscalculations on the Bridgeport Tower project nearly bankrupted the firm. Ask him why he really lost everything. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and venomous. Arthur flinched, as if struck visibly, crumbling under the public assault, the weight of the twisted truth crushing him. He looked desperately towards the exit, his instinct to flee overwhelming. The crowd murmured, confused, disturbed, their gazes shifting uncertainly towards the man on the stage. But then Eleanor stepped forward, taking the microphone from its stand, her eyes blazing with cold fury. "Enough!" Mark, her voice, cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. The entire room froze, yes. She said, her voice ringing with absolute conviction, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces before settling back on Mark. There was an incident on the Bridgeport project years ago, an incident I had investigated thoroughly. She added a subtle glance towards Sophia, confirming her preparedness when Mr. Vance first joined our team here. And yes, Arthur Vance's name was tied to it. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. But he wasn't fired for incompetence, she declared, her voice rising. He was forced out because he refused to compromise on safety standards. He refused to sign off on rushed work and substandard materials being pushed by executives focused only on deadlines and profits. Executives perhaps like you, Mark. He raised concerns repeatedly, and when a structural issue arose due to those ignored warnings, he took the blame to protect younger engineers on his team who were being pressured to stay silent. She turned towards Arthur, her expression softening for a moment. He lost his career, not because he failed, but because he upheld his integrity when others wouldn't. Arthur looked at Eleanor, stunned by her fierce, unwavering defense, by the fact that she knew and believed him. Strength drawn from her conviction and the memory of his promise to Leo began to push back against the wave of shame. He straightened his shoulders and stepped towards the second microphone on the podium. His hand trembled as he grasped it. He's right, Arthur began, his voice shaking initially but growing steadier with each word. There was an incident, a beam specification. It was ignored by management to save costs. He looked out not just at Mark, but at the sea of faces watching him. I refused to approve the final drawings, I warned them, when the inspection revealed the fault just before catastrophic failure. Scapegoats were needed. He took a deep breath. I took the fall. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was protecting others. Maybe I was just tired of fighting. He looked directly at Mark, now his voice quiet but firm. I lost my career, yes. But I kept my conscience, and given the same circumstances, I'd make the same damned choice today. A profound silence descended upon the atrium. The raw honesty, the quiet dignity in his admission resonated far more powerfully than Mark's angry accusations. The murmuring stopped, or people looked at Arthur now, not with suspicion, but with a dawning respect. Mark Jennings stood frozen, his face contorted in fury, but utterly silenced, isolated in the wake of Arthur's courageous truth. Eleanor moved to stand beside Arthur, a silent, unshakable pillar of support. The celebration had become a trial, but in facing the fire, Arthur Vance had finally truly reclaimed himself. In the quiet after the storm, truth settles like dust, revealing the solid ground where new beginnings can finally take root. A heavy silence hung in the vast atrium, thick with the residue of shock, anger, and finally dawning respect. Mark Jennings stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of impotent rage, utterly exposed and isolated by Arthur's quiet dignity and Eleanor's fierce defense. No one rushed to his side. At a subtle nod from Sophia near the edge of the room, 2 discreet security personnel moved quietly towards him, murmuring something only he could hear. Defeated shoulders slumped. Mark allowed himself to be escorted unobtrusively away, vanishing from the event like a ghost finally exorcised. The tension in the room didn't disappear instantly, but it transformed. The polite applause from earlier was replaced by a palpable wave of empathy directed towards the man standing vulnerable but resolute on the stage. Eleanor took a steadying breath, her hand resting briefly on Arthur's arm in a gesture of silent support before she turned back to the microphone. As I was saying, she began, her voice clear and unwavering, though tinged with a new layer of emotion today. We honor the kind of character that shines brightest, not when life is easy, but when it is hardest. Arthur's courage, not just on a cold night over a year ago, but his courage today, standing in his truth, is the very essence of the values we hope to embody at Infinity Group. Her gaze met Arthur's, warm and filled with unwavering belief. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a simple white envelope. Arthur, you've given so much to us. Your perspective, your empathy, your quiet strength. You've helped us rebuild our heart. She held the envelope out to him. This is just a small step towards helping you fully rebuild your own foundation. He took it numbly, his fingers still trembling slightly. Inside, he found the official stamped title deed to the small rented house in Brooklyn, now transferred fully and legally into his name. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the implication registered. Eleanor leaned closer to the microphone, a genuine radiant smile finally breaking through. No more sleeping in trucks. Arthur, she said softly, the words carrying immense weight after the day's revelations. This time the applause that erupted was thunderous, heartfelt and sustained, washing over Arthur, not as noise, but as acceptance. He looked down at the deed, then out at the sea of faces, then at Eleanor, beside him, tears blurring his vision once more. But these were tears of pure, unadulterated relief. Later that evening, long after the shaken but ultimately uplifted employees had dispersed, Eleanor found Arthur standing alone on the deserted rooftop terrace, gazing out at the indifferent lights of the city. The preserved coat still stood on its easel in the empty atrium below, a silent witness. She came to stand beside him, the silence between them comfortable, charged with the unsaid emotions of the day. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. He turned to her, his expression still processing the emotional whirlwind. I think I might be," he said slowly, a tentative wonder in his voice. Being afraid of the truth coming out. It was heavier than the truth itself. He looked at her, his eyes filled with profound gratitude. "You stood by me, Eleanor, when everyone else—" There was never a question, she interrupted softly. He reached into the inside pocket of his borrowed suit jacket, his hand closing around a small, worn box he had carried for weeks, waiting for the right moment. He hadn't planned for this to be the moment, not after the chaos of the day, but suddenly it felt like the only moment, Eleanor. He began, his voice thick with emotion, as he pulled out the box. "You didn't just give me a job, or defend my name, or give me a house." He struggled for words. "Today, standing up there with you, beside me, you gave me back my voice, my truth." He opened the simple box. Inside, nestled against worn velvet, was a plain silver ring shining quietly in the ambient city light. "You said that coat changed your life," he continued, his voice trembling now. "But you, Eleanor Vance, you saved mine. If there's anything more valuable to me now than that old coat." He held the ring out to her, his heart pounding against his ribs. "It's you, Eleanor. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes, mirroring his own. But these were tears of pure joy, reflecting the city lights like captured stars. A soft, choked, beautiful laugh escaped her lips. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she breathed, nodding through her tears. "Of course. Yes, Arthur. Yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, his hand shaking but sure. They stood together under the vast city sky, wrapped in a quiet intimacy, the storms of the past finally giving way to a hard-won, deeply earned peace. The most beautiful celebrations aren't always the grandest, but the ones built on foundations of truth, resilience, and simple, unwavering kindness. 1 month later, Arthur Vance and Eleanor Vance were married. There was no opulent ballroom, no 5-star catering, no meticulously curated guest list designed for networking. Instead, they chose to exchange their vows within the warm, brightly lit walls of Joseph's Place, the modest red brick community center that had become the heart of their shared story. The space glowed with a genuine warmth that no amount of money could replicate. Children from the center's programs had gleefully crafted chains of colorful paper flowers that draped from the ceiling. The chairs borrowed from various sources didn't match. The slightly lopsided wedding cake was baked with love, by one of the shy interns from Arthur's mentorship circle at Infinity Group. The guests were a vibrant tapestry of their intertwined lives, Leo standing tall and beaming as his father's best man, Sophia wiping away a discreet tear, volunteers from the center, colleagues from Infinity, including the young man whose life Arthur had touched, families Arthur had connected with during his time seeking shelter, and dozens more whose lives had been quietly enriched by the couple's journey. Eleanor wore a simple, elegant white dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes shining only for Arthur. Arthur stood waiting for her, wearing the same borrowed suit from the Kindness Day event. But today, it seemed to fit him perfectly, imbued with the quiet confidence he now carried. During the vows beneath a banner, joyfully painted by the children, Eleanor held Arthur's hands, her voice clear and sure in the suddenly hushed room. "Once on a freezing night, you gave me your only coat," she said, her gaze locked with his. "You offered warmth when you had none to spare. Tonight, Arthur, surrounded by the community you've helped nurture, I give you my whole life." Her words fell over the room like sunlight through a stained glass window. Soft, radiant, unforgettable Arthur couldn't speak. He simply nodded, tears slipping unashamedly down his cheeks as sniffles echoed softly from the guests around them. Laughter followed the tears, music filled the air, and the simple reception spilled out into the center's small courtyard. As twilight descended, children ran barefoot through the grass, their shrieks of joy mingling with the happy chatter of adults. Strings of fairy lights blinked on, casting a magical glow over the improbable, beautiful scene. Someone with a camera captured a moment, Arthur and Eleanor standing side by side beneath the worn Joseph's Place sign. Her head rested trustingly on his shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. And beside them, placed there intentionally for the photograph, stood the easel from the Kindness Day event, still holding the framed, frayed olive jacket. A silent, powerful testament to where their improbable journey began. That image and the story behind it would eventually find its way beyond the walls of the community center. A quiet symbol shared online, resonating not just as a tale of second chances, but as proof of how profoundly a single unhesitating act of kindness could ripple outwards, rewriting lives, bridging divides, and reaching into the coldest corners to offer warmth and light. Arthur Vance hadn't had much on that snowy night, but he gave what he could. A simple coat, a moment of human connection. In return, he hadn't just changed Eleanor Vance's life. He had found his own way back to love, to purpose, to family, and ultimately back to himself. Their story became a quiet reminder that kindness doesn't require perfection, only presence. Not grand gestures, just a willingness to see the person shivering beside you and offer what little warmth you have. Arthur and Eleanor's journey began with a single simple act, offering a coat against the cold. How often, perhaps, do we pass by opportunities for connection, shielded by our own assumptions or haste? Their story reminds us that beneath the surface of circumstance, wealth or poverty, success or struggle, lies a shared human core capable of both deep hurt and profound kindness. Rebuilding trust, finding the courage to accept a second chance, or learning to see beyond the exterior. These are not easy paths, are they? Yet it's often in these challenging journeys that we find the truest measure of ourselves and the unexpected strength in vulnerability. This story leaves us thinking about the quiet power of truly seeing another person and the ripple effects that can flow from one moment of genuine empathy. We believe every story holds a connection, and Arthur and Eleanor's journey certainly resonated deeply with us. How did it make you feel? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What to you does seeing someone truly mean in today's world? Let's share our perspectives. If Arthur and Eleanor's story touched your heart or gave you something to reflect on, please show your support with a like. And if you feel this story might offer hope or resonate with someone you know, please share it. You never know whose life it might touch. For more stories that explore the complexities of the human heart, resilience, and the enduring power of kindness, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey together. Thank you for sharing this time with us. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep looking for the light in unexpected places.